Welcome to Developing Lifetime Study Skills and Habits. This session is called Making Conclusions. So today we want to talk about making conclusions or interpretations. For some, interpretation sounds kind of, rather weighty. How could I ever make an interpretation? So we could also use making conclusions. It's just as good, perhaps. And I'll probably use the two interchangeably. So far, our focus has been on making observations. And I think we have, we've talked about observations, making questions, and really making questions is just another way of trying to find out, get more observations. We've talked about using correlation, looking for patterns, using other scriptures or cross-references. We talked about all this in the last couple of sessions. Very important. Again, all this is just kind of helping us to build up making good observations. Today, we want to talk about making conclusions or interpretations. And the next time, we want to go to personal applications. Now, let me say this. I know I keep saying this, but I want to say it again. There's a lot of overlap here. Sometimes is that a conclusion or interpretation, or is that really an observation? There's some overlapping here, and that's okay. Let's don't get hung up on those things. The thing we want to emphasize is that making conclusions, that's very important. Making conclusions, well, first of all, good conclusions or good interpretations are more than a guess. And the way I kind of see some people kind of, interpret the scriptures, I think they're just kind of guessing, or maybe they're kind of, well, this is what I kind of like. I feel good about this. Good conclusions and interpretations are more than just our opinions. A good conclusion is based on good observations, using questions and correlation and cross-references and all these things. Often, in fact, maybe even usually, conclusions are built upon not just one observation, but a string of observations. And the more observations you have, the stronger your case is going to be. You could put it this way. Observations are like your pieces of evidence that you're using to make a case. Let me give an example. You run across someone, her name is Susan, and she tells you you're a doctor. Well, you don't know what type of doctor. I mean, there's quacky doctors. There's doctors of, that are of not just medical doctors, but, Then you find out maybe a little bit later, Susan works at a hospital as a surgeon. Okay, well, that kind of helps. Okay, that's the second observation or a fact that you've, understand. Then you also kind of know, maybe especially by asking some questions, the hospital pays their doctors, especially their surgeons, a good salary. Then you find out Susan lives in a big house in a very nice neighborhood. So you can make a conclusion then, therefore, Susan makes a good salary. Maybe you didn't ask her how much she makes, she didn't tell you, but you can probably make that's a pretty good, reasonable conclusion, isn't it? But you see, we looked at, okay, here's some facts, some observations, and therefore we can make a conclusion. Now we can do the same thing with the scriptures. Here's an example. We're reading through Luke. We see in Luke 4, Jesus heals Peter's mother-in-law. Then in Luke 6, Jesus heals the man with the withered hand. Luke 7, Jesus heals the centurion's servant. Then we see in Luke 8, Jesus heals the woman with the hemorrhage for 12 years. Then we see Jesus heals another woman who had been sick for 18 years. So we've got some observations there. So we could make a conclusion saying, therefore, Jesus heals every godly person. No, we can't really say that, can we? That would be a wrong, right? Okay. But maybe we could say, therefore, Jesus healed many different types of people in his ministry. Is that true? Yes, that would be an accurate observation, wouldn't it? Another example, you're doing a study on following Jesus. And I'm just we're not going to read all these passages, but Luke 18, the story of the rich young ruler, and you're kind of looking at what it says about discipleship and following him. And then you happen to go to Mark 10, verse 28 and 31, and where Jesus says, there is no one who's left house and mother and father and all these relatives and then he says, along with persecutions, but that he's going to receive 100 times as much, houses and mothers and brothers and sisters and all that. Okay, that's good. Then you go to Luke 14, and it talks about the cost of discipleship, and it talks about no person, a military leader is not going to just go out and fight, and his army, if the other army is a lot bigger, he's going to count the cost. And so everyone who follows Jesus in discipleship. And then you kind of see John 12, 24. Unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains by itself alone. The passage, I don't need to go into all the detail. Then you read in John 16, where Jesus says, in the world you'll have tribulation. But don't fear, take courage, because I'm going to be with you. In John 15, we see a passage where it says, expect to be hated, expect persecution. Then on the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5, it says, blessed are you when people insult you and call you all sorts of names. And blessed are you when people persecute you. And you notice, wait a minute, it doesn't say, blessed are you if people insult you. It says, when people. So you could start to, the more passages and observations you make, and you could probably make 3 or 4 observations from any of these, you could start coming up with some conclusions, such as following Jesus will not always be easy. There will be challenges. There'll be difficulties. There'll be persecution. There'll be tribulation. Is that a solid conclusion? Yes. Based upon these passages, we can say that. Another example, you're looking at bearing fruit. And you look at John 15 about bearing much fruit. And then you look at the parable of the sower, bearing fruit 30-fold and 60-fold and 100-fold. And then you see where Jesus says, by this is my Father glorified, that you bear much fruit. By the way, I don't have a slide for this up here. Then you read another section where it says bad fruit versus good fruit. You'll know who are mine by their good fruit. Then you read about Galatians 5, about the fruit of the Spirit. And you can kind of come up with all sorts of observations, right? And based upon those, you can make a number of conclusions about bearing fruit, how we've been appointed to bear fruit, a lot of things, couldn't we? So good observations make good conclusions. That is why we've taken so much time in talking about making observations and not just kind of throwing out an opinion or an idea that we have. Making good observations requires time and it requires study. And then based upon all the observations we make, then we can begin to build and start making interpretations or making solid conclusions. Okay? So that's kind of the introduction there to making conclusions. The best way to do this is how? By actually doing it. So here's your assignment. Number 1, in Colossians 1 verse 13. And by the way, those of you who are part of the doulos, we're going to be having a retreat coming up here in about 4 weeks or so, and we're going to be studying the book of Colossians. Okay, we're going to do a book study on it, and now it's a big book just to do in just a couple of days. I know that we probably won't get through all of it, but I hope we'll at least get through about the middle of the 3rd chapter. That's my goal. But between now and then, you're going to start working on some stuff. So in Colossians 1:13, it refers to the domain of darkness. So I want you to come up with 3 conclusions about the domain of darkness. Now, what does that mean? You're going to need to kind of come up with some observations. You're going to need to kind of come up with maybe some cross references where it talks about the domain of darkness. It may call it the kingdom of Satan. It may call it a lot of different things. And then you could be able to make some conclusions about what exactly is the domain of darkness and how does it operate. Okay, so you got to use cross references and make sure you have adequate evidence to support your conclusions. And then the second thing, I want you to do a book survey, just like you did before. And you can get from Jennifer a copy of the, the little handout on the book of Colossians. Now, last time when we did it, we kind of did it real briefly. This time, I want you to do it thoroughly. That means looking up who is it written by, who is it written to, what are the main purposes, what was going on in the church in Colossae. And you also need to begin reading that book several times, looking for what? Key themes, key phrases, key words. And based upon that, and when we meet again, I'm going to give you something else to start doing for Colossians, but I think this is all going to be helpful in our book study that we're going to be doing on this. Really a beautiful, and I also feel like a very timely book for us to look at. Okay? Thank you.